As Gordon mentioned, we want to continue an exercise that we began last Sunday evening, in which we're just going to talk about the Old Testament storyline. We're just going to try to get the chronological events as they occurred in the Old Testament, have a good view of them in order. And that's what we want to continue in our study tonight. I think this is a worthy enterprise. We try to engage our young people in the Bible drill class every Sunday night in this thing. We have a set of flip charts, and the pictures that you will see here on the screen are just taken from those flip charts that we've been using for several years, trying to get our children to recognize the Bible story in chronological order. When we had our meeting last fall, Ben May, whom we helped to support in the preaching of the gospel down in Lawrenceburg, he came, and if you remember in the Bible class on Sunday morning, he had a lesson along this lines, just the Bible story in order, and several people expressed appreciation for that. So I think it's a good thing, a good exercise for us. I told the young people it may be the case because they've been studying this for years. They may know this story better than some of us know the story. But we all need to be acquainted with the famous events of the Old Testament and try to have them sort of in a chronological order in our mind, sort of see the big picture of the Bible story. So that's what we're going to continue tonight. We stop here just briefly to say thanks to you all for being here. As Gordon mentioned, we have visitors, and we're grateful for our visitors. And we want you to come back every time you have a chance to be here. And of course, we're open to any questions you might have about what we're doing here at College View. So let's just real quickly, I don't think we're going to be able to do this every week, but we can this time. Let's just real quickly mention the story that we told up to the point where we begin again tonight. Obviously, the Old Testament story begins with creation. God created everything. As we said last week, He created everything from nothing. And so God's creative work is plainly told in Genesis chapter 1. We know the first man and woman were Adam and Eve, and unfortunately, they were the first to sin. They brought sin into the world when they violated the simple instruction that God had given them in the Garden of Eden. You can eat of every tree of the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Satan tempted Eve. She ate of the tree. She gave it to her husband Adam, and he ate. And sin entered into the world, and the horrible consequences of sin entered into the world. Adam and Eve had two sons. Their first two sons were Cain and Abel. They, as we mentioned last week and mentioned again in our lesson this morning, they were the participants in the first recorded acts of worship in the Bible. God instructed them to give sacrifice. Abel's sacrifice was pleasing to God because it was by faith. Therefore, we know it was according to the instructions that he had received. He pleased God by doing what God said and doing it the way God said. Cain, on the other hand, did not. Cain was furious and he killed his brother, Cain and Abel. We talked about Noah. The next great event recorded in the book of Genesis begins in chapter 6. Talks about how the world had become incredibly evil, and God determined to destroy the world and its inhabitants. But Noah found grace in the eyes of God. Noah and his family were spared, but Noah had to construct that ark in order to be saved from the flood which ensued. A huge assignment, a tremendous job. Noah, a great character of faith in the building of the ark. We talked about how God scattered the people at the Tower of Babel. And after the flood, God's instructions were for men to disperse, to scatter, to repopulate the earth. Men apparently were determined to stay focalized or localized with a focal point of the tower that they were building at Babel. And at that point, God confounded the languages of men, and they scattered because of that. All right, that brings us to where we're ready to pick up our story tonight. And our story tonight, here we go. Our story tonight has to do with the man Abraham. Actually, beginning in about chapter 12 of Genesis, the storyline becomes more focused. And really, the rest of the Old Testament story has to do with the history of the descendants of a particular man. And that man, of course, is Abraham. We often say that the Old Testament, really the whole Bible, while not a history book, the Bible wasn't written to be a general history of the world, yet the Bible contains an awful lot of history. It's not specifically a history book, but it has lots of history in it. And primarily it is the history of God's dealings with the descendants of Abraham. Abraham was a great man of faith, and God called him. And in Genesis chapter 12, if you want to now open your Bibles, we'll read a few passages as we go along. In Genesis chapter 12, we read about God calling Abraham. Verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be blessed. You shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God calls Abraham to leave his home, to leave his family, and to go to a place that he'd never been to before, that he had never seen before. I think we sort of take it for granted that Abraham would do that thing, but imagine what a challenge that would have been. What if someone just told you to do that? I want you to just pull up stakes and take off. Go someplace where you've never been before, but if you go there, I will bless you when you are there. Abraham believed God, and he acted upon that. And he left his homeland and went to this new land, the land of Canaan. Can you help us out there, Kyle? Because this is going to really need those pictures if we can get them back. He went to the land of Canaan where God had showed him. This period of time in the Old Testament we call the patriarchal dispensation, because God was dealing with the heads of families, the patriarchs of families. And so this was before written language. This was before men had the capacity to read and write. And so God was directly dealing with the heads or patriarchs of the family. Abraham would have been one of those kinds of patriarchs. He believed God, and he was obedient to God. And in Abraham we learn the lesson about faith and obedience. The kind of faith that God requires of us is an obedient faith, a faith that leads us to do what he said to do. It's not a faith that just says, I believe, but rather it is a faith which causes us to act. And we see that in Abraham and in so many others. If you're still there in Genesis chapter 12, notice verse 4. Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife and Lot his nephew and all the possessions which they had accumulated. So he was obedient. Faith and obedience seen clearly in the story of Abraham. But there was a problem in Abraham's life, and his problem was that he had no heir. His wife Sarah was barren. She hadn't borne any children to him, and so he was concerned that he didn't have an heir to pass on things to. But now think about this. God had already promised Abraham, your descendants are going to be a multitude of people, a great nation of people. They're going to occupy the promised land, and through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. There was a threefold promise made to Abraham. Abraham getting a little impatient. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen. He doesn't have an heir yet. In chapter 15 of Genesis, in chapter 15, verse 1, after these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, Do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, O Lord God, what wilt thou give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Since thou hast given no offspring, Abram said, Since thou hast given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This man will not be your heir, but one who shall come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And so Abraham has been promised things, but he's a little worried. It doesn't seem to be happening like I thought it was going to happen. God made promises, but Abraham didn't see them coming true just yet. And so in chapter 16, where we remember Abraham and Sarah sort of dreamed up a scheme of their own, maybe to help God in these plans. In chapter 16, verse 1, Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So Abram then does have a son, but not by Sarah. He has a son by this handmaid Hagar. We know the name of that son was Ishmael. They had an idea that maybe they could help God's plan along. God didn't need that help. And that actually ended up being quite a conflict in Abraham's family. It was not a good thing that they had done in trying to sort of step in and help God's plan to come to fruition. If they had not done that, things would have gone a lot more smoothly. This was a problem. Hagar and her son Ishmael became a problem to Abraham and to Sarah. And probably there's a good lesson for us there. You know, God's made promises. We just need to trust His promises and do His things His way, instead of imagining that we can come up with something better, that we can maybe help or modify or somehow improve upon God's plans and God's methods. That it never works. It never works. And it did not work in the case of Hagar and Ishmael. God kept telling Abraham, "You wait. The promises will come." In chapter 18, look in chapter 18, verse 10. Genesis 18, verse 10. He said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Wait a minute. I thought Sarah was going to have a son or have a child. Now she's past childbearing. Waited too long. Oh, we waited too long. Is anything too hard for God? Is anything impossible for God? She was past the age of childbearing, but she's still going to have a child. He said at this time next year, she will have a son. And the fact of the matter is that God's promise was fulfilled. Chapter 21, verse 2, Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. So Abraham, his son, the son of promise, the son through whom God intended to fulfill all the promises that He had made to Abraham, was born to Sarah, and his name was Isaac. Abraham and Sarah, as we're trying to picture there, were old when Isaac was born, past the normal time at which they would have children, but God gave them this son, Isaac. Well, in the very next chapter, God really tests Abraham. If you look in chapter 22, verse 1, chapter 22, verse 1, it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." And He said, "Take now thy son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. I'll tell you, sometimes we like to put off unpleasant things. We often talk about the problem of procrastination. There's something I know I ought to do. There's something I'm supposed to be doing. I don't want to do it, and I'm just putting off doing that. Can't you imagine that this instruction from God to Abraham, offer your son Isaac? Don't you imagine that would have been a horrible thing to contemplate and something that you very much would like to postpone or procrastinate? But notice, Abraham was a man of faith. When God instructed him to do something, he acted. And it says early the next morning, he arose and went to do what God had told him to do. Of course, we know that Abraham was ultimately prevented from killing his son and offering the sacrifice, but he had the knife raised and he was ready to sacrifice his son at God's instruction. The Lord prevented him from doing so, and instead there was a ram caught in a thicket nearby, and Abraham used that as the sacrifice to the Lord. But Abraham's faith was on display here. The Hebrew writer tells us that Abraham believed that even if he did sacrifice him, God could bring him back from the dead, even as he had really, in a sense, done so when he was born, because he and Sarah were past the age of childbearing when Isaac was born. But again, a great testimony to Abraham's faith. Sometimes we imagine that we've been told hard things to do, difficult commands to obey. I'll tell you, we've never been given a command as tough as that one, I think, and yet Abraham was obedient. This is why, of course, Abraham stands out as a great hero of faith in the Old Testament. So we've got Abraham and his wife Sarah. Their son is Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah then. So Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah have two sons. They were actually twins, but not identical twins. They were fraternal twins. They did not look alike. They were different, considerably different in appearance. The name of those two were Esau, the firstborn of the twins, and the second was Jacob. Esau and Jacob. In chapter 25, if you keep reading there as we go along in this Old Testament storyline, in Genesis chapter 25 at verse 27, it says, when the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter and a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And when Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished. Therefore his name was Edom. But Jacob said, first sell me your birthright. And Esau said, behold, I am about to die. So of what use then is the birthright to me? And Jacob said, first swear to me. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and little stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. This is some information that we've just recently been studying in our Sunday morning Bible class. The birthright was what normally came to the firstborn, the oldest child. And the birthright involved a double portion of the inheritance. And so Esau would have been in line to receive twice as much inheritance as Jacob. It was his birthright. He was the firstborn. But here, he shows that he had no respect or consideration for that sort of thing. And because he was hungry, I don't think he was about to die, but because he was hungry, he sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. And we always, it is pointed out, the New Testament calls Esau a profane person. That is, not having respect for things that are precious and valuable. And certainly that was the case with Esau. He sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. Now there was something else also that would have typically come to him, and that's referenced as the family blessing. And so as the firstborn, not only would he get a double portion of the inheritance, but he would also have been blessed by his father to now become the next head of the family. Remember, we said this is the patriarchal period. And the patriarch, the head of the families, had a significant place. So Abraham passed that on to Isaac, and Isaac would have naturally passed this blessing on to Esau, the firstborn. But that's not what happened, because Rebekah, the mother, got involved. Look in chapter 27 at verse 15. Chapter 27, verse 15, Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her elder son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. She gave also the savory food and bread which she had made to her son Jacob. Then he came in to his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, who are you? And Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. We often point out that there's a lot of sort of ugly, just less than honorable events recorded among some of these Bible characters, and this is certainly one of them. Rebekah had favoritism for Jacob. She wanted him to receive the blessing. And so she dressed him up and cooked food. While Esau was out in the field hunting for his father, Jacob came in and deceived his father, who was blind in his old age, and he received the blessing that should have gone to Esau. His mother helped in that deception. Well, as you can imagine, Esau was really angry about that, and he vowed to kill his brother Jacob. And so Jacob was sent away. Jacob was sent away. His mother said, I hope it's just for a few days until your brother cools down. But it ended up being 20 years. Jacob left Canaan land, and he went back to the territory that Abraham had left years before. They still had relatives back there. In fact, Rebekah's brother was still back there, and she sent Jacob to her brother Laban. And for 20 years, Jacob was away. While he was away, he worked for the man who became his father-in-law, Laban. He ended up marrying two of Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel. And from them and two handmaids were born 12 sons to Jacob. So Jacob becomes the father of 12 sons. He had 6 sons by Leah. He had 2 by her handmaid Zilpah. He had 2 sons by Rachel and 2 by her handmaid Bilhah. All of those sons were born while Jacob was away, with the exception of the last one, the youngest one, Benjamin. And so Jacob had been away, but when he came back, he had a big family, and he had been enriched by the time that he spent serving his father-in-law, Laban. He comes back. He comes back to the land where he grew up as a child. He came back to the land that God had ultimately promised to give to Abraham. But not everything was really happy with the sons of Jacob. Jacob showed favoritism. In particular, Joseph was his favorite son. He pretty grossly manifested that favoritism toward Joseph. We remember that he gave Joseph a coat of many colors, again, an indication of his preference for that one son of the many that he had. In addition to the overt favoritism of Jacob toward Joseph, Joseph also had some dreams, some apparently prophetic, revelatory dreams, in which it indicated that he would be over his brothers. And that made them even madder, and they were very jealous against him. And so they sold him as a slave. Look in Genesis 37. In Genesis 37, verse 23 beginning, came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, and the very colored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal, and as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and to cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then some of the Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. And so Joseph was sold as a slave. A lie was told to the father, saying he had been killed, or led the father to believe or draw the conclusion that he had been killed by a wild beast in the field. But in reality, he was actually a slave in Egypt. But Joseph was really a good person. I think our young people could really learn a lot from the example of Joseph, and we've often used him as a sort of a case study for young people and how you ought to act even when circumstances are not the best in your life. He's a slave. Who wants to be a slave after all? But even as a slave, he was an honorable person, and he lived right and he did the best that he could. Notice in chapter 38, Genesis 39 and verse 1. Genesis 39, verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. So he was a slave, but he was doing well as a slave, and his master Potiphar saw, this is a good man, and things are going well for me because of him, and I'm going to put him in charge of everything that I have. But you know the fly in the ointment. The fly in the ointment was actually Potiphar's wife. In verse 7, it says, it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Our young people need to remember that statement from Joseph. How could I do this great evil and sin against God? You know, I think that it would not be hard to imagine that it would have been in Joseph's personal interest to commit the sin that Potiphar's wife was encouraging him to commit. He might use that to his advantage. He might get her on his side. She might speak to her husband. Maybe he could be set free. All kinds of things might have been racing through his mind, but one thing was primarily in his mind. How could I do this great evil and sin against God? He never forgot God. He never forgot the importance of being loyal and faithful to God. Well, Potiphar's wife is mad because he has refused her, and so she lies about him and says that he had in fact assaulted her, and Joseph is thrown into prison unjustly. He hadn't done a single thing wrong, but he was unjustly thrown in prison and left there to languish. He was a good person, and even in prison he showed himself to be a good, honorable person, doing the best that he could. He interpreted some dreams while he was in prison. You young people know the story. There were two men in the prison who were high up servants of Pharaoh the king, the butler and the baker, and they had fallen out of favor with the king, and he'd thrown them in jail. They each had a dream, and Joseph was able, I think, by the power of God, to interpret the dreams. Seems clear that Joseph was an inspired interpreter of dreams, and he told the butler that he would be restored to his position. He told the baker, you're going to be executed. It came true. It came true. And the butler was restored to his position in Pharaoh's house, but he forgot about Joseph for another couple years or so. But finally, Pharaoh himself had some dreams that troubled him, and the butler remembered, there's a guy in prison. He interpreted my dream and it came true. I bet he could interpret your dream. And Joseph was called for, and he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. He had two that had the same message. There are going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of collecting grain and making preparations during the 7 years of plenty, so that they would have something to eat in the 7 years of famine which would follow. Joseph was made a ruler in Egypt. In fact, he was second in command only to Pharaoh himself. What a story. What a turnaround. I want to tell you, there's a lesson, I think a moral lesson in that for us. Joseph was the kind of person who was going to do the right thing no matter what. Even when others were doing bad around him and even treating him despicably, he was determined to do the right thing, and it worked out for him. And I believe that we could learn the lesson. If we do what is right, God will ultimately bless us. I believe that's true in this life and in the life which is to come. God will bless us. Well, in course of time, after the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of famine hit, and Joseph's family came down to Egypt because they heard there was some food stored up there. And they themselves came to Egypt. You may remember the story of how Joseph finally identified himself to his brothers who had in fact sold him as a slave. But ultimately, they moved there. The old man, the father, Jacob, was still living, and he and all the rest of the family moved to Egypt. In chapter 46, verse 5, Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and their little ones and their wives and the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. And they took their livestock and their property which they had acquired in the land of Canaan and came to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons and his grandsons with him, his daughters and his granddaughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. And so the whole family moves to Egypt, about 70 persons at that point in time. Jacob died there. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob is the father of the 12 sons. Jacob eventually dies in Egypt. Joseph ultimately dies as well in chapter 50 of Genesis. In chapter 50, verse 22, now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons. Also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Everything had been going well for these Israelites. We know that we just recently studied that Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and his descendants then became known as the children of Israel, or just Israelites. And everything had been going well for the Israelites in Egypt because their brother, Joseph, was like number 2 man in the whole country. Everything was going well. But then, when Joseph died, things changed. The story rolls right over into the book of Exodus. And in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, it says, Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to the people, Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war they also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses. And so at the time that after Joseph died, the children of Israel, the continuing descendants of Abraham, right? That's the story we're following. We're following the descendants of Abraham. Now they are in Egypt, and they are slaves in Egypt. If you want to know how bad it was, keep reading there in Genesis chapter 1, verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. And the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and at all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was Puah. And he said, When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then he shall live. Pharaoh puts out an order. He's afraid these Israelites are multiplying. They're becoming such a significant number of people. He's afraid if there's a war, and especially if they side with the enemies, this will be a devastating thing to us. So his solution to the problem was kill the male babies. When the babies are born, a daughter can live, but if it's a boy baby, kill the babies, was the instruction. And we'll end our study for tonight with the birth of a particular son. Notice in chapter 2, verse 1, Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. This is Exodus 2. Verse 2, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. And you know how the story goes on. Moses then was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He wasn't. She effectively adopted him. And so he was raised as the adopted grandson of the king of Egypt that we call Pharaoh. Well, we'll stop our storyline there with the birth of Moses, a very significant character in this Old Testament storyline. You're getting this all in chronological order. That's our intention, is to make all of this sort of fit together in a flowing history, because that's really what the Old Testament is a flowing history of these notable characters in the Old Testament. But remember, it's not just history. We're not just studying events. We're also learning moral lessons from these people. For instance, tonight, what a great moral lesson we learned from Joseph when he was tempted to sin, and yet he resisted that temptation because he wanted to be right with God. We need to be like Joseph in that way. We're tempted with sin. We need to remember those words that Joseph said, how could I do this great evil and sin against God? That needs to be on our minds all the time. We don't want to sin against God. And so, again, our point here is to emphasize, while this is interesting history, I think, it's more than that. It's lessons with moral implications for us. We can learn from that, and we can make application in our lives. Thanks for your good attention to what we had to say. And Lord willing, we'll continue our study in this Old Testament timeline next week. We're going to sing a song of invitation. As we sing this song, we'll be asking everyone, make sure your life is right with God. If it's not, let us help. If that means you need to obey the simple gospel plan and become a Christian, we're ready to assist you. If you are a Christian already, but you need the prayers of the saints, if we can help in any way, let us know while we stand and sing this song. Someday you'll stand with the Lord on high. Someday you'll record you'll sing. Someday you'll answer the question of life. What will your answer be? What will it be? What will it be? Where will you stand?